The French and Indian War, which erupted in 1754 and lasted until 1763, was a critical conflict that shaped the future of North America. But to understand the war, it's essential to grasp the tensions that had been brewing for decades between the British and French empires. These two European powers, both eager to expand their territories and influence, had long eyed the rich and resource-laden lands of the New World. Their competition was fierce, and by the mid-18th century, it was clear that a showdown was inevitable. In the early 1700s, both Britain and France had established colonies in North America, but their territories were not neatly divided. The British colonies were primarily located along the eastern seaboard, stretching from the northern region of New England down to the southern Carolinas and Georgia. These colonies were densely populated, with thriving towns and cities, bustling ports, and a growing economy based on agriculture, trade, and manufacturing. In contrast, the French territories were vast but sparsely populated. The French claimed a large portion of the interior of North America, including the Mississippi River Valley and the Great Lakes region, which they called New France. Unlike the British, the French settlers were fewer in number, and their economy was largely centered around the fur trade. They established a network of trading posts, forts, and small settlements, relying heavily on cooperation and alliances with Native American tribes to maintain their influence and control over these vast territories. However, the boundaries between British and French claims were ill-defined, and both empires laid claim to the Ohio River Valley, a region rich in resources and strategically vital for controlling the continent's interior. This area, which lay west of the Appalachian Mountains, was a melting pot of competing interests, where British colonists, French settlers, and Native American tribes vied for dominance. The stage was set for a conflict that would engulf the entire continent. The spark that ignited the French and Indian War came in the early 1750s, when both the British and French began to assert their claims more aggressively in the Ohio River Valley. The British, encouraged by colonial governors, started to grant land in the region to settlers and land companies, prompting the French to respond by building a series of forts to solidify their presence. One of the most significant of these forts was Fort Duquesne, located at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, where they meet to form the Ohio River. In 1754, a young and ambitious British officer named George Washington was sent by the governor of Virginia to deliver a message to the French, demanding that they withdraw from the Ohio River Valley. The French politely but firmly refused, and Washington returned with orders to build a fort of his own. However, before the British could complete their fort, the French attacked and captured it, renaming it Fort Duquesne. Undeterred, Washington led a small force back into the region, where he encountered a French scouting party. In the skirmish that followed, a French officer was killed, marking the first bloodshed of what would become a full-scale war. Washington quickly constructed a makeshift fort, Fort Necessity, but it was poorly located and easily surrounded by the French. After a brief but intense battle, Washington was forced to surrender, marking the first major engagement of the French and Indian War. This defeat was a significant blow to British ambitions in the Ohio River Valley, but it also galvanized the British government into action. The British recognized that they could no longer allow the French to expand their influence unchecked, and they began to prepare for a broader conflict. The war had begun in earnest, and both sides began to muster their forces for the battles that would follow. The early years of the French and Indian War were marked by a series of setbacks for the British. The French, with their smaller but more agile forces, were able to outmaneuver the British in many engagements, thanks in large part to their alliances with Native American tribes. These tribes, who were familiar with the terrain and skilled in guerrilla warfare, played a crucial role in the French strategy. They conducted raids on British settlements, ambushed supply lines, and harried British forces, making it difficult for the British to gain a foothold in the contested territories. One of the most significant early battles of the war was the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755, where a British force under the command of General Edward Braddock was ambushed and defeated by a combined force of French soldiers and Native American warriors. Braddock, who had little experience with frontier warfare, had marched his troops in traditional European battle formation through the dense forests of western Pennsylvania, making them easy targets for the French and their allies. The battle was a disaster for the British, with Braddock himself mortally wounded and his army suffering heavy casualties. Despite these early defeats, the British were determined to turn the tide of the war. In 1756, Great Britain formally declared war on France, expanding the conflict beyond the borders of North America and into Europe, Africa, and Asia. This marked the beginning of the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that would reshape the balance of power around the world. As the war dragged on, the British began to make significant changes to their strategy. Recognizing the importance of the colonies to the war effort, the British government began to invest more resources and manpower into the conflict. One of the key figures in this new approach was William Pitt, the British Secretary of State, who believed that victory in North America was essential to securing Britain's global dominance. Pitt poured money and troops into the colonies, building up the British military presence and forging new alliances with Native American tribes who had previously sided with the French. The turning point in the war came in 1758 with the capture of Louisbourg, a French fortress on the Atlantic coast of Canada. This victory gave the British control of the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, effectively cutting off French supplies and reinforcements from Europe. The following year, the British achieved another major victory with the capture of Quebec, the capital of New France. The Battle of Quebec, also known as the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, was a decisive engagement that saw British forces under General James Wolfe defeat the French army led by General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. Both Wolfe and Montcalm were killed in the battle, but the British emerged victorious, and the fall of Quebec marked the beginning of the end for French power in North America. By 1760, the British had gained the upper hand in North America, and the French, now severely weakened, began to seek peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, officially ended the war and redrew the map of North America. Under the terms of the treaty, France ceded all of its territories in mainland North America to Britain, including Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi River, except for the city of New Orleans. Spain, which had entered the war on the side of France, ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana, which the British had captured during the war. The French and Indian War had profound consequences for all parties involved. For the British, it was a triumph that solidified their control over North America, but it also left the British government deeply in debt. To pay off this debt, the British imposed new taxes on their American colonies, leading to widespread resentment and, eventually, the American Revolution. For the French, the war was a devastating loss. They were forced to abandon their colonial ambitions in North America and shift their focus to other parts of the world, such as the Caribbean and India. The loss of New France also meant the end of French influence over the Native American tribes in the region, leaving them vulnerable to British expansion. For the Native American tribes, the war was a disaster. Many had sided with the French, hoping to preserve their lands and way of life. But with the French defeat, they found themselves at the mercy of the British. The British victory led to a wave of colonial expansion into Native American territories, sparking new conflicts and further displacing indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. The French and Indian War was more than just a military conflict. It was a turning point in the history of North America. The war set the stage for the rise of the British Empire as the dominant power on the continent, but it also planted the seeds of discontent that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. In the years following the war, tensions between the British government and its American colonies began to escalate. The British, burdened with debt from the war, sought to recoup their losses by imposing new taxes and regulations on the colonies. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and other measures were deeply unpopular in the colonies, leading to protests, boycotts, and eventually violent confrontations. The war had taught the colonists that they could stand up to European powers, and the experience of fighting alongside British regulars had given them the confidence and military experience they would later use in their struggle for independence. The war also had a lasting impact on the relationship between the British and Native American tribes. The British victory opened up vast new territories for settlement, but it also brought new challenges as colonists pushed westward into lands claimed by Native American tribes. This expansion led to a series of conflicts, including Pontiac's War, as Native American leaders sought to resist the encroachment on their lands. The British government, seeking to avoid further conflicts, issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited settlers from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. However, this measure was largely ignored by the colonists, setting the stage for further clashes between settlers and Native Americans. The French and Indian War was not just a North American conflict. It was part of a much larger global struggle between European powers. The war had far-reaching consequences, reshaping the balance of power in Europe and around the world. In Europe, the war left both France and Britain exhausted and deeply in debt, leading to political and economic instability in both countries. In the years following the war, France sought to rebuild its economy and military, but the loss of its North American colonies was a significant blow. The French monarchy, already facing financial difficulties, was further weakened by the costs of the war, contributing to the conditions that would eventually lead to the French Revolution in 1789. For Britain, the war marked the height of its imperial power, but it also exposed the challenges of governing a vast and diverse empire. The British government struggled to maintain control over its far-flung colonies, leading to a series of crises that would ultimately result in the loss of its American colonies in the Revolutionary War. Despite the setback, Britain would go on to expand its empire in other parts of the world, including India and Africa, solidifying its position as the world's leading colonial power in the 19th century. The French and Indian War also had a significant cultural and social impact on the people of North America. For the colonists, the war was a formative experience that helped to shape a distinct American identity. The shared experience of fighting against a common enemy, combined with the growing resentment toward British rule, fostered a sense of unity among the colonists that would later be crucial in their fight for independence. The war also had a profound effect on the Native American tribes involved in the conflict. Many tribes had fought alongside the French, hoping to protect their lands from British encroachment. However, with the French defeat, these tribes found themselves increasingly marginalized and displaced as British settlers moved into their territories. The war marked the beginning of a long and tragic period of conflict and displacement for Native American peoples. as they struggled to maintain their lands and way of life in the face of growing European settlement. In reflecting on the significance of the French and Indian War, it is clear that the conflict was a turning point in the history of North America. The war not only determined the fate of the continent, but also set in motion a series of events that would shape the future of the United States and Canada. For historians, the French and Indian War is a rich and complex subject of study, offering insights into the dynamics of colonialism, the interactions between European powers and indigenous peoples, and the causes and consequences of war. The conflict also serves as a reminder of the fragility of empires and the unpredictable nature of history. What began as a localized struggle for control of the Ohio River Valley ultimately became a global conflict with far-reaching consequences. Today, the legacy of the French and Indian War can still be seen in the cultural and political landscape of North America. The war's impact on the relationship between the British government and its American colonies laid the groundwork for the American Revolution, while the conflict's influence on Native American tribes continues to be felt in the ongoing struggles for indigenous rights and recognition. The war also left a lasting mark on the geography of North America. The borders and territories established by the Treaty of Paris in 1763 continue to influence the modern political boundaries of the United States and Canada. The French and Indian War may have ended more than 2 centuries ago, but its effects are still felt today, making it a pivotal event in the history of the Americas. In conclusion, the French and Indian War was a multifaceted conflict that had profound and lasting consequences for all involved. It was a war that reshaped the map of North America, set the stage for future conflicts, and left an indelible mark on the history of the continent. The story of this war is one of ambition, struggle, and change, and it remains a vital chapter in the ongoing narrative of the Americas.